God, we thank you for minds to think, mouths to speak, ears to hear, and hearts to understand. We've got to love the readings for today. We've got a woman being created for man, even though God had to put the man to sleep for a while in order for that to happen. Then we have severe prohibitions against divorce. Now, sometimes you get a chuckle. We've all been to weddings, and you hear the readings at weddings. Oh, a man shall leave his father and mother and join to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. When God is joined together, let no one put asunder. It's funny how the readings don't continue with the next verse, which says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. That's not something you hear preached about too much, at least in the Episcopal church. But there's a first time for everything. It's not going to be this time. So we're going to focus on the last few verses of the Gospel, which talks about Jesus and the little children. So from the message, to paraphrase the message, the people brought children to Jesus, hoping that he might touch them. The disciples shooed them off, but Jesus was irate and let them know it. Don't push these little children away. Don't ever get between them and me. These children are at the very center of life in the kingdom. Mark this, unless you accept God's kingdom in the simplicity of a child, you'll never get it. Gathering up the children in his arms, he laid his hands and blessed them. The New Revised Standard Version that we read from today puts it, that is, to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. There are lots of things we hear in church. We hear them over and over and over again, sometimes so much that we lose the context, we lose the meaning, we don't even think of it, we kind of gloss over them. And this reading is one that we hear a lot. It's in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, twice actually in Matthew. And before we can talk about seeing the kingdom of God as a child, we have to think about what the kingdom of God is. You know, it's something we hear all the time. It's another one of those things. They're like, kingdom come, thy will be done in the Lord's Prayer. What does that mean? I think there may be two interpretations that I've come to understand. One is the kingdom of God can mean the second coming of Christ. You hear a lot about that in Revelation. And the other is the one that we hear in the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done. So maybe the kingdom of God is God's will being done here on this earth. The kingdom of God is mentioned 14 times in today's gospel. So it's got to be important. It's important to understand what it means. And I think that what the disciples understood about God's kingdom was a little bit different than what Jesus was trying to get them to understand. I think Jesus was trying to get them to understand that the kingdom of God comes to us when we are sorry for the things that we've done wrong, and when we seek to have God's Spirit dwelling in us, in bearing the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, humility, self-control. When we look at the readings, Jesus didn't say that the kingdom of God belongs to children. He said it belongs to those who have the qualities of children. So what are some of the qualities of children that you folks can come up with? Any thoughts or ideas? Qualities of children.
Innocence.
Innocence. Acceptance. Some more?
Open mind.
Okay.
Purity.
What's that?
Purity.
Okay. Purity.
Fun.
Fun. Can't even think of that. The ones that I wrote down that I thought of were gentleness, simpleness, trusting by nature, receptive, guileless. You know, these are all qualities of children. And we could talk about all of those and how they relate to the gospel of Jesus. Trust is something that we know that kids have in their parents. As a father of 3 and as a stepfather of a couple more, I remember how it was when they were young and how much they trusted in you. And sometimes you just felt so unworthy. So imagine having a God who we can have total reliance and total confidence on. I'd like to focus for a moment just on 2 of the qualities of children that are typical. Gentleness and simpleness. Gentle and simple. So what famous saint comes to mind when we think about gentleness and simpleness? Hint. We're doing the blessing of the animals today to celebrate St. Francis. Thank you. Now, there are folks from St. Francis here, so I was hoping that someone would remember that. Yeah, and we're in the season of Francistide. The Feast of St. Francis was this past Thursday, October 4th. And Francistide, like we have Christmas time or Easter time, Francistide for Franciscans is a time of year that we reflect on Francis, the founder of the Franciscan order. And that's one of the reasons that Father Christopher asked me to share today, because the reading from the Gospel about children is a natural lead-in to Francis, who really epitomized that gentleness and simplicity. Some of you know that I'm a Franciscan. What does that mean? Well, we know there was this guy, St. Francis, who was born into a fairly average family, fairly well off, fairly well-to-do. And he inspired a few folks to follow him. At first, just 3 or 4 people. They went around a ragtag band of guys. They didn't have fancy habits. They just, wrapped the equivalent of burlap bags around themselves with a cord. And that's why, today you still see some Franciscans with the habits and the cords. But that wasn't meant to be a clerical or a religious kind of investment. That was just functional. So we had this bunch of guys he was going around with. And then St. Clare of Assisi was inspired to follow him. But in those days, a woman couldn't go do what Francis wanted to do, couldn't go out and preach. So Clare dedicated her life living in a cloister in a convent with the ministry of prayer. And then there were folks who saw and liked what Francis was doing. They said, we resonate to the spirituality he has, but we have families, we have jobs, we have kids. We can't just leave everything and go off and follow you. So Francis founded the Third Order, which was a way for people to live into the spirituality that Francis was talking about without leaving their secular vocations and lives. And today in the worldwide Anglican community, there are about 3,500 Franciscans between the First Order brothers, some of whom you've seen here selling bread, and the sisters, and the Third Order. And it's really on all 5 continents. 5 or 7 continents? How many continents are there? 7. I think there are 7 continents. All 7 continents.
In Antarctica?
Oh, I don't know. Now we're going over my paper. And so like Francis, Third Order Franciscans are called to live simply, spreading the spirit of love and harmony. So we have Francis, we have the children, we have Francis, and that was where my story comes into play, because I'm a moderately intelligent person. Though I was raised in the Episcopal Church, I had all kinds of experiences in other churches, Roman Catholic, Evangelical, Pentecostal, Orthodox. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what church was right, reading early history, going to Bible studies. And the more and more I did that, I was getting away from Jesus. I was getting caught up in the sophistication, the theology, and taking my eye off the joy, the spontaneity, the simple faith that children have. So in Francis, I found this guy who I was able to resonate to in my spirit. And that's something that moved me to become a Third Order Franciscan. If we look at the gospel stories about seeking the kingdom as a child, each one of them is followed by the story of the young rich ruler. You remember him? He was the guy who tried to do things by law and not by spirit. He had all these possessions. He didn't want to give up his possessions. So Francis, counterposed to this, is a person who lived his life in radical simplicity, physical as well as spiritual. And the beauty for me about Franciscan spirituality is that a person doesn't have to be well-educated, doesn't have to have amazing gifts and talents, just has to have the faith, the trust, and the spirit of a little child. Brother Juniper was one of Francis's early followers. And the anecdotes about Brother Juniper is he would do silly things. Francis would be preaching and Juniper would be saying things in the background. Francis would be walking on the road and Juniper would be like clowning around behind him. And there are some people that think he might have been even developmentally disabled. But Juniper got the essence of what Francis was about. Juniper acted like a child. He acted with that simplicity and the joy that was typical of the early Franciscans. And like any order, like any movement, like any church, when something becomes institutionalized, you can lose some of that initial spark, the thing that got it all going. And Juniper was there as a witness to Franciscans of what it really means to follow Francis, to follow Jesus with that simplicity of a child. Some of us, like Juniper, have to unlearn some of the rules, the regulations, the constricting traditions of religious experience. And we need to be reminded that in order to understand God and God's kingdom, as Jesus wanted us to, as Francis did, and as children do, we have to have that sense of gentleness and simpleness and joy that children have. God, our Creator, you always delight to reveal yourself to the childlike and lowly of heart. Grant that following the example of Blessed Francis, we may count the wisdom of this world as foolishness and know only Jesus Christ and Him crucified, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.